The first poem I'm going to read is called An Duanaire, the singer. Clearly it's about a singer, but as much as that it's about a place. The place is the Leabhar, which is one of the principal music venues in Cork. And everything that's in this poem either happened on a particular night at the Leabhar, or happened in one of the songs being sung that night, or happened in my head. And I like that idea in a poem that all those things have equal reality. The thing that you thought, the thing that happened, the thing that was spoken or sung. I became very friendly towards the end of his life with the great Scots Gaelic poet Ian McAgowan, Ian Creighton Smith, and there was a story told about Ian that he liked to plant plastic flowers in his wife's garden, and his idea was, what's the difference? And that's in his poetry also. One of the powerful images in his poetry is of a deer, the deer on the high hills, which seems poetic and traditional and that, but equally he used to ask, well, why can a Coca-Cola bottle not carry equal significance and poetic truth? So I suppose part of that idea is also in this poem, which I'll read both in Irish and English. An Duanaire, the singer. Is dóilis an mertos mo chóir gur leo son na bhain a lauren, nor a chanan a ghol trí ghráver, is fada le bara a méir go meisiad sa bhaile, is cad shanama a chéile go maidin. Is at le héan arain is le hir leanain, go meach faun briste a gríthe bhar a hanga ag fear nor casagor a hana. Nor a bhuilen na strangan a siade, a cheangil da chéile an chéad lá riaviad, dridden an lánúin fósta da muochas I le chéile. Nor a chimlíon iling a léin a siúd le gúling a bhaná, buinen fearóg hevel an tomra janzi saurig do, is iran ar a tí an tasí slú in enam dílis dé. Guian an chalín a bhfuil áilecht an bhráin in a gnúis, go meise gan chéile no go bhaise I. These two here in front of me think he's singing to only them. When he plays a loving lament, their fingers ache to be home where they can play on each other until morning. The lonely and the old flames are amazed. A man they've never met has the broken tunes of their dreams off by heart on the tip of his tongue. When he touches the strings that tie them together the first time ever, the married couple in the corner move closer in spite of themselves. When the sleeve of the man's shirt brushes his wife's shoulder, a young fella at the other end of the room takes off his summer jumper and asks the barman to turn the heat down for God Almighty's sake. The girl, made lovely by sorrow, prays he'll never rest until he finds her. Outside, a fleet of sirens storms the night, squad cars, ambulances and fire brigades running from the fire that can't be put out in the smouldering hearts of the men inside, who are late again for the never-ending funeral. Beside the bridge, the Morse code of loneliness, broadcast on flurries of air, is clear as day to the man who has just jumped. The water is smooth as a sheet, and he is deaf to the world as the music fills his mouth, washing away a world of worries. The singer keeps on strumming the strings that stretch from the heart to the mouth of his guitar. His cry is soft as the river, a blanket of water drawn up over all our sleepy heads. In Acandrihid, tá nodarach don uignis chilhíní an air os a hiún léite go crín ag an bhar atá díreach tréis léimt. Tá tuisce chomín le baralín, is tán áling an cheoil in a bhéal á bhóra bhuairh an tail. Leanan an ceoltóir is semant na srangan a folla a hínan an grí go dtí béal a gitar. Tá chiine cho séh le plid na hawan á tarint os ar giún go léir. I'll read a number of poems which are Australian poems, some of them quite obviously so, some less obviously so. I was always tickled by the idea when I lived in Australia that everything was reversed somehow, that if it was nighttime in Cork, it was daytime in Melbourne. If in Ireland it was winter, it was summer. In Australia, the water went down the other way around in the sink, and that seemed to be hugely significant. But equally, certain images in the poems meant something else when I was away from home. So suddenly the rain became a very positive thing. I can't imagine I would have written as warmly on rain if I hadn't been in Australia. As indeed in this poem, it's a very, very old poem now, a kind of a love poem, I suppose, called Báisteach or Rain. An cúrán na chathaigh síos na déaga is alchemic a culling a tríd, farige, fair as fuchsia in na déag seachtón é. De hiúil haar braid sa tráid ar air, nos cumalium mar bháisteach. Cór a brinne ar a rútín clé is lúba airgid ar a ristaí ganam ní. Mar a bheith scá ferringe sa ré, dúmpig mo chrí isteachas amach féin gi cúra ná fluchach bara ma bhéir. Nor a deirig an chrían, haar bhil gúling in nír, hí cúracht cnis ar bhláhan a teo chrasa, a brise tre la cacha na caharach. That perfume she wore in her teens shot through with the alchemy of her body, sea, grass and fuchsia in 1979. Walked past on the street last night, as couldn't care less as rain, a birthmark on her left ankle and silver bracelets on her untouchable wrists. Like an umbrella in a gale, my heart turned inside out under a drench of fragrance that left my fingertips bone dry. When the sun rose over her shoulder, tropical flowers perfumed like skin burst through paving stones all over the city. This poem is called Didgeridoo, and I suppose I was struck by the fact that the didgeridoo really only plays two notes, but there's a whole music contained in those two notes for people attuned to that particular acoustic, and I felt listening to the didgeridoo that it was completely alien to my ability to hear the things that somebody tuned into that particular culture and its many languages could hear. And I think ultimately the idea here is that actually what makes cultures and perhaps languages unique and makes it therefore necessary to preserve them intact as they are is that beyond a certain point you can't enter completely another culture and a language. You can make appropriate gestures, you can make signs of goodwill, you can learn and perhaps appropriate it, but there is something different in that to being inside the skin of another language or music. Didgeridoo. Ní bhealach an ceol seo na haar ní a níos as íochtar cishán de bhuilig le brothal seanama na mro ann teo chrasach. Ní chuir sé de chus cheanarcach a steprink leach gan buchas de daigine cheartaiseach le sprang taish na gasfort cahach. Má hasan tú gan chur fa second of ein no míle blian, chuir sé alta le réan a neadú I measc na guach de chléan old caum. Paroidi, gorama, glasa, dearaga do huilí luiscithe is cucabor a nigóidech a fanóid fe de chosa gala. Beg trefna ors an air a cleternach timpelort a laurtleat de mail rá ná tigan de chrí, gaulghéalach, bán. Ma hasan tú Gá chiad blian a géistecht, cloisiir ceol stair a chinne a sille as unthar páulta, géir rob a éan na knag a pléas go snappa mion chnáv, agus dór na gala ar sínsir knasta a búala chrecin na talún mar a bheith bórán ná mohían faic. This music is not played to lure a snake from the woven basket of your distended belly with a heat wave of torrid notes and swooning melodies. It won't set your rebel foot tapping on stone to taunt your straight-jacketed intellect with squalls of hornpipes and twisting slides. If you stand and listen for a second or 1,000 years, lyrebirds will nest in the devious loops of your branching hair. Blue, green and red parrots will perch on your scalded shoulders, and the sarcastic kookaburra make fun of your scorched white feet. You'll hear parakeets and lorikeets flutter round your head, ancient tribes of the air speaking a language your wild colonial heart cannot comprehend. If you can stand for a minute or 200 years, you'll hear the songs of his people bleed from a punctured lung, sharp beaks pecking skulls, snapping small bones, while the bright fists of our gentle ancestors beat the skin of the earth like a Paor that feels nothing. So when we lived in Australia, I was at home raising a mysteriously increasing number of children over a period of about 10 years. My wife worked full-time, and the central experience of my life and the most significant experience of my life was as a homemaker and as a father, with all the mysteries that entails. And I'm curious, increasingly curious, I suppose, about time with all of its ramifications, and I'm interested particularly in moments that are non-negotiable, moments that mark points in time that you can't go back beyond. Usually it's somebody's death, but the birth of a child equally is something permanent and final in its own way, and I think that's what's being discovered somehow in the course of this poem called Idir Dhá Lín, or In the Meantime. Idir Dhá Lín tá ann na gúirteoirí hart, is time hasav ag stadan vos, trasna na sráide ó ospedéal riaga na man, graim dochtagum lábha na leanaí. Tá áthas sa curdi in áda cín mar is gná, agus áras a drathar a pléasca le hiisce. An áin na dróracha thugus dom mar baul, ní is a go má halamh an dain cén in óga bhfuilan tú id hasav le dvorla beag dóchas is caca. Níl adaring ach lehead sráid gratan, cera úr lár agus pasáiste gear anta septach, ach tá sé rá dhéanach henne le dul siar ar na puil bheoga in rompla an ama. Má gá láimh a chur timpeall ort, is féachant ar de ghualing amach, ar a gréatúr bocht ag stadam vos, a bhfuil íomh an tonis ar a bhéal, agus graim scuilte ag na leanaí ar a lábha. Tá in ag chur di gan stop, in nniuh a pléasca le hiisce, a mairech in a colla, caiach ar ocht a máthair. In the meantime, visiting time is over, and there I am, standing at the bus stop, across the street from the Royal Women's Hospital, holding my children's hands as tight as ever I can. Happy prattles away 13 to the dozen as per usual, while dubious the brother is bursting for the toilet. After all the directions you gave me a short while ago, for the life of me I can't remember which window you're standing at with your little bundle of hope and shit. There's nothing between us, only the width of Grattan Street, 4 floors and a short antiseptic corridor, but it's already too late to cross over the small potholes in the surface of time, to put my arms around you and look out over your shoulder at the poor fool still there at the bus stop, smiling all over his face, his children barely holding on to his hands. Yesterday, still going 13 to the dozen, today, bursting for the toilet, tomorrow, blind, asleep in her mother's arms. The first time I ever read that poem was for a group of American students, and at the end one of the students said, actually everything you write is in that particular line in that poem. Which line? I said. He said, hope and shit. That's it really, isn't it? And PhDs have been awarded to people for far less perceptive remarks, I think. So we lived for 9 years in all in Australia, and Robert Frost has famously said that home is where, when you have to go there, they have to take you in, but it's also the case that you have to leave home to go home. And when you're an immigrant, the whole idea of home is much more contested, much more powerfully present also. So this poem is called An Cló Iar-Chonnacht, or The Creator, and I suppose it makes the usual genuflections expected in an Irish poet towards home and place, towards certain place names which have an almost ritual significance, it seems. But actually, finally, it seems to me that what the poem discovers is that home is as much who you're from as where you're from. An Cló Iar-Chonnacht. Saréir go námhaid in níos as scibol doracha hís bhóthar na mó erme, hí gob éin na fógart an lé, ag cnaga scragel chapín budéal vanne lic an doris mo. Sa a rúsig an tig as a chuan ré bhrethe, hí an dain chuhí féinice, dain deabhhainte nar laurin a cuine, a ghéal go réig, dúdarás cuin a láv. Nuair a doscail sí an scone, chimmel an tuisce smut fuair lena basa, lig lena hanga a mér a tíortha. Nuair a chas an buachar a rais, lean srán hillan an nóir a bincas a sink, agus kittel bascathe a bacadíl a sorn, ní a bhéin ní gan locht sa tig seo. Before the morning rose from a dark shed below on the Model Farm Road, a bird's beak announced the day, packing the tinfoil top of a milk bottle out on the doorstep. Before the house woke from its prenatal sleep, she had the world to herself, a well-mannered world that didn't answer back, giving in quietly to the gentle authority of her hands. When she unmuzzled the spout, cold water nuzzled her hands, licking her dry fingers. When she turned off the tap, the runny nose continued to drip in the sink, and a gimpy kettle limped on the stove. Nothing was perfect in this bockety house. Chipped dishes welcomed her, plates, mugs and egg cups jostling each other, until she filled their hungry mouths with cornflakes crisp as frosted grass, handsome eggs with moles on their cheeks, and tea so strong a mouse might scamper across its steaming surface on tiny legs of faith without drowning. Up the stairs in limbo, land of pillows and blankets, rags of sleep bandaged his brain like cotton wool in an aching ear. He heard the muffled sound of the small shovels scraping stone as she cleared the ashes of the day gone out and set another day kindling in the cold grate. He heard gusts of static pitched from one end of the Atlantic to the other, churning the airwaves between Reykjavik and Athlone, until she found the right frequency that put Cork at the centre of the world, talking to her quietly in the kitchen, 6 feet under his dream. As morning followed morning, forever and ever it seemed, he heard his world created out of nothing, as it was in the beginning, is now, and shall be for a time to come in the mind of the Creator, until the clock wakes her from her eternal dream. Thula sé gae statica eschewed ó cheann ceann na hAtlantica ag umrah An Duanaire idir Reykjavik is áluin, go raimsigh sí an viniciad chrín a chur corcaig ag geartlár an tíl, ag caint le os ísil sa chistan sé trethe laistís dá hairimh. Maidin in ige chéile mar sin go brach, thula sé saoil á chrathú as naní, mar a bhí ar dúis, mar atá inis, mar a bheith go fóil in aigean an chrutha hóra, nó go músglóig an clogaí as a bringlóid hiarí. I think it can't often enough be insisted upon that poetry is fiction also, and takes the same kind of liberties occasionally as fiction does. And I'd like to say in particular that the reference to chipped plates in my mother's house is fiction. She'd be very annoyed if I didn't make it clear that there was never such a thing in our house. But for poetic effect, it was necessary for them to be less than perfect. Okay. I'll read 2 short poems from a series of poems that I've been working on now for some time, and they're a little different, I think, from some of the earlier work. They're very much concerned with the relationships between fathers and sons over 3 generations, not necessarily me and my father or me and my son, but quite clearly that's part of the reason I'm interested in these things. Also, I think that those relationships are not as well covered and explored in literature generally as they might be. And there's another element to these poems. I'm interested in the idea that Patrick Kavanagh put very well when he said the key challenge really for poetry is to be able to play a true note on a dead slack string. So there's an experiment here, I suppose, of a kind to discover how you can flatten language and use very unassertive words to carry a burden beyond what they usually would carry. And there's a play on time here also. Seamus Heaney, I think, famously said somewhere that Irish people should not alone be able to be in 2 places at the one time, but to be in 2 times at the one place. And I really like that idea, and it's in these poems also. First poem is called Tligini, or Bells. Tan vaidin cho socer de Gonamara, go glosim cligin on ifig hAthghabhála I glos an tógálaí, Leabhar on dig. An bháisteach cho hétram, go mraham girannail mahar, is é smita bloc an aimad, chúl an tí I gorcaig. Nor a gléan ma bham mon gistan, íon sé a bháthar féin árál in ahar, teach isteach an An Duanaire sar a bhúró sé. Tá sé demlíon a díis, is tá ahar cho garadól in a chrecin féin. An bhaidin cho socair, go glosin sé cligín ifige in aigene vic, blianta fadó bhaile, árális, gúla róhan diantaige go fóil, teach isteach an ish sar a bhúró sé. Bells. This morning is so quiet in Connemara, I can hear the office bell ringing in the builder's yard, half a mile from here. The rain so light, I feel my father's heavy breath as he chops wooden blocks behind the house in Cork. When my mother calls out from the kitchen, he hears his own mother telling his father to come in for his dinner before it gets cold. He's 10 years old, and his father is as close to him now as his own skin. The morning, so still, he hears an office bell in his son's head, years away from home, telling him he's done enough for now to come in before he goes cold. Start again. Luascain. Sa gardín folamh tá luascain gorum a luasca gan éine á bhrú ó hirsig an ghéad an obair leanna buí gan buachas. Ná corrig a derim leis an leanamh im cheann, ná ligart gur féidir a tain é dhéanamh. Go mratha tú a láimh le do ghrám, a glór crusta Maria á ráiliat gur fodó riamh bachorda de bheith ábalta tú héin a chur sna flahis bheoga gan éine do do bhrú. Ar 9 a derim leis an ahar in maigine, is a bhac a fiachan tre galóg leagrid amach, luascain gorum atá luasca gánaí ar éigen sa gardín folamh, gan éine á bhrú, éine néachar. Swings. In the empty garden there's a blue swing barely moving, and no one pushing it, since the wind got tired of its childish, thankless work. Don't move yet, I tell the child in my mind. Don't let on you can do it yourself, till you feel his hand at your back, his voice pretending to be cross as he tells you you're old enough now to be able to push yourself as high as you want to without anyone having to push you. Of course, I say, to the father in my mind, and his son looking out through the half-drawn blind at a blue swing, still moving, but only just in the empty garden, with no one to push it, no one at all. So I'll finish up maybe with 2 love poems, reasonably recent. The first of these is called Multitasking, at which famously women are better than men. And perhaps it's best I say no more than that about it. There's a reference in the poem to a novel by John Banville. The novel is Birchwood, quite an extraordinary novel. So here we go, multitasking. Ná habair le do choil gur clas é seo a dimmer an solas is an dusta le chéalaram. Gur be a sky le chnoch sa winóg sin is na háiristí an ní go mar maidin, a géisteach leis a radio sa chuine, agus tusa ag íar náil é a dtíine leanaí, a lehéisteach lumsa mar is gná, a tuairtamach féin saoil mar atá. Ní ró sa tairamh, chnoch go siléir le mghá féin tú a dul timppel hín a tí, agus is agam go ma go raibh an sun leistíordom, a ligintart bheith géisteach lumsa is an radio tur. Son na siochána níor vacas fiú le féchant chléchána char mo ghóling, a ggéirigh brethart, I stig is a mo san éon am a bhain. Treis 5 bliana fihid den obair seo, tuigim nach éon stróhart, bheith an sun in ecilium agus fós in áit eile nach féidir tú leanúint. Ní honan is an téisian in uorscéal Banville, a bhí ar tí dul amach tríd na dóirse francocha sa tig angla éarnach, nor a chas ar a háil ag an neomad dernach, is go raibh uignas dochreidte an chuidéile dá héal I níag an duine a déatach teachdáin dá siúlach sé tríd an doras glunne idir é agus é féin. Is féidir leatsa a bheith ann agus as, an mo is a stig, éon uair is maileat, a teacht is a gemacht, tríd an doras nar chuoine mé riamh a gúne idir tú is tú féin. Agla gomach fánartaí a leanúint, an bhean ó go chuig tríd na dóirse francocha fadó, atá fanúint leat fós ag bín an tí. Tá tú a portaracht os íseal ar mo chúl, cór a folasach go bhfuileann tú I stig leat hain in nniuh. Nor stadan an chantaracht go hoban, brahim de chuile dul trím is mé fearre tríd a bhuinó amach, don man a bhfuil uignas an dain a gcónaí in a díagaram, is ná éiriglim fós teacht suas lé. Dá raing cho fada le bín an tí a chrí, ní móide a ríis go gasing. Multitasking. There's no point telling me it's a trick the light and dust made up to deceive me, that it was your reflection I saw in the window as I washed the dishes this morning, listening to the radio in the corner while you ironed children's clothes, half listening to me as usual, giving out about the world and its ways. No, I wasn't dreaming. I saw you clear as day with my own 2 eyes going past the gable end of the house just now, when I knew in my mind you were there behind me, letting on to be listening to me and the dead radio. For the sake of peace, I didn't bother glancing sideways over my shoulder to try and catch you inside and out at one and the same time. After 25 years and more of this, I know it's no bother at all to you to be there alongside me and away somewhere else I can't follow you. Unlike your man in Banville's novel, who's about to go through the French doors in the Anglo-Irish mansion when he turned back at the last moment and was afflicted by the most incredible loneliness for the rest of his life, for the person he might have become had he stepped through the glass door between him and himself. You, on the other hand, can be there and not there, inside and out, whenever you like, coming and going as you please through the window I never closed between you and yourself, just in case you might want to follow her, the young woman who went out through the French doors all those years ago and is still waiting at the gable wall. I hear you singing quietly behind me, a sure sign you're in with yourself today. When the singing stops, I feel your eyes go right through me as I stare out the window at the woman I've been following all my life and never managed to catch up with. If I went as far as the gable wall, my love, it's unlikely I'd ever turn back. Sorry. This is a poem called Marmalade, and it's one of those poems that moves unexpectedly in ways that you didn't expect, which is what you're always looking for in a poem. It's a great story, again, told about Patrick Kavanagh. Was asked how he was getting on with a novel, and he said it had been going very badly for several weeks now, that he had driven some cattle into a field and he couldn't get them to come out again. And there was a sense in writing this poem that it was moving in a direction that I was only just about able to keep up with. And it's usually a sign that you're going to get into trouble with the poem, either during writing it or after it. But in any event, this poem is called Marmalade. Buinem a chapín den brochas suvaráiste is líanan an vaidin de vla sharav, ni ha Milish, Algiers, Morocco, Seville, mar bhfuil buamí cúra crochta dhéag na grón. Nuair a phléascan a dalamh bán, na cína bhfuil rian folatríthas deisilim, lushtar an tair mór himple, le glóréh loide is maragaí sráide, in áitena náróas riamh, ach gur cuin le marrón a hunson, am la sharav, ni ha Milish. Nuair a ilm a gistan, trécht ag maister haar teoring na géad faoi, mar rua de cheann bocht sa tusa agus pussart. Is siup an bhúistéir a cheanís na hráistí sin in agus mise mé héin a dhéim de chuid marmalade, Milish agus sharav mar is maileata. Go díreach a derimse, agus buamí cúra de cholinge a lushke an air a mahímpel. Tá an réamhlóid tosna hana I maraga sráide machrí, díreach an ece le seastán na naráistí. Marmalade. I opened the jar of marmalade and morning fills with the bitter, no sweet taste of Algiers, Morocco, Seville, where fragrant bombs hang from tree branches. When they burst on the bare ground, I like the ones with blood in them best. The air is scorched all around with the noise of revolution and street markets in places I have never been, but still my nose remembers their bitter, no sweet smell. When I return to the kitchen, worn out from wandering beyond the borders of the senses, get real, you say, frowning. I bought those oranges yesterday in the butcher's, and it was I who made your marmalade, bitter-sweet, the way you like it. Exactly, I say, as your body's fragrance detonates, burning the air all around me. The riot has already started in the street market of my heart, just there beside the stall of oranges. So there's a real challenge for somebody working in a minority language when it comes to negotiating between that language and a majority language like English, the fear being that somehow the translation will eclipse the original, and particularly the danger is that a bilingual reader in Ireland who, without a translation, might pluck up the courage to negotiate the original if faced with, on facing pages, an English translation, is more likely to take the soft option and read the English. So even amongst the immediate and primary readership, you might lose readers to the other language. If you have a poem by Cló Iar-Chonnacht and a translation by Seamus Heaney, there's a real temptation to read Cathal through Seamus or read Seamus in place of Cathal. So that's, I think, the basis for the anxiety that people writing in Irish have when it comes to the unequal power relationship between Irish and English. For me, the key thing in translation is that the translator is competent in the original language, and that's not always the case in translation from Irish to English. It seems to me that a translator who works from cribs is already working at 2 removes from the original, and that many of the principal choices have already been made by the cribber, even if the cribber is the poet him or herself. So for me, the translator has to have fully inhabited the original poem first and then be sufficiently competent in English to be able to carry across as much as is possible of the original. So I've been really blessed with my translators, Mary O'Donoghue, Biddy, Jenkinson and Kevin Anderson, all of whom are more agile in English than I am, but have agreed to work with a register of English that might be credible for me when I speak the English translations of my own poems. And to their great credit, for the most part, they've been happy not to engage in solo runs, to do kind of fancy things that would feel uncomfortable for me as an English speaker, speaking my own poems in a second language. One of the things that is noticeable, however, in the translations, and it's only very recently I became aware of this myself, is that the rhythm of the original has been transposed in a way that I hadn't expected. That when I was working myself on translations of the poems, certain possibilities in English seemed wrong to me, but I couldn't quite say why. And I realise now it's that the music of the original, not the sound patterning so much as almost the syllabic count of the original, right, was beating in my own mind, and that I was trying to fit the English to that pattern. And I think that the translators also might have had that in their minds. So it's not just that the imagery of the Irish is carried across into the English, which is the easiest part to carry across. The narrative element is easy to carry across. The sound patterns really are kind of impossible to carry across, except as a kind of a muted rhythm that asserts itself in the English translation. And I find that when I'm reading and moving from one to the other, actually the pattern set in the reading in the Irish carries me through the English for the most part also.
Is there also a way in which the translators are not English, they are Irish who speak English? So you were getting a different rhythm in the way they would speak English in any case. You're getting their Irish-English rhythm.
Yeah, I honestly don't know the answer to that, Neil. I don't think it's a matter of ethnic background. It's a matter of the competence in the original. Because I haven't worked with somebody who's competent in Irish, who's English or American or whatever, I can't really say how that would be, you know.
Were you born speaking Irish?
Let's speak to this again, yeah. Like most people in Irish, so Irish is my second language. It's the first language of my writing, and it's also the first language of my academic work. But I am a first language speaker of English, exposed to Irish from the age of 4 through the school system. I learned it like everybody else did. It was compulsory to learn Irish, as indeed it was compulsory to learn Shakespeare, trigonometry, algebra, and I'm always baffled that Irish people should report to have had such negative experiences of learning Irish language grammar without following the logic through to how they were forced to learn Keats and Shelley and mathematical complexities that really were of no use to them in their lives. I learned Latin also at school, and I have found that Latin has been far more practically useful to me than anything I learned in maths class after the age of 6. But my relationship with the language was always a positive one. It seemed to me from the age of 4 that there was something exotic and strange and at the same time completely familiar about these words that corresponded to objects that were familiar to us, but that the words themselves were completely unfamiliar. So the very first words in our first reader, the first page of the reader had a picture of a cup and a saucer, and it was cup on and fóch upon. So cup, cup on, that's not really that strange, but fóch upon was odd for a saucer. So I found that intriguing, and yet the cups and saucers were familiar to us, more familiar perhaps from country relatives we had. There were those patterned blue and white hoops that almost every rural Irish family would have had at a certain period of time. So even that suggested that the language belonged in the countryside rather than in the city. We didn't have those kinds of cups and saucers, but my aunties and uncles had them. So I felt that the Irish language corresponded to a world that was not the world I lived in, but was only a bicycle journey away. It was the kind of world that my relatives had just come up out of, although they were English speaking. The sound patterns that they had were Irish language sounds. that were less prominent in the way people spoke English in the city than they were in the countryside. So from the age of 4, like I say, I had a second language, and I could never really understand why anybody would think that that was a burden in any way. So the Irish language has been on the brink of extinction for a couple of 100 years, but it is possible that it could die in my lifetime. It's only since 2006 that Irish census returns have given an accurate picture of the number of people who actually speak Irish every day. So right through the 70s and 80s, governments were let off the hook by the fact that the census simply asked, could you or can you speak Irish? So even in the recent census, 1.4 million Irish people identify themselves as able to speak Irish. But it's only since 2006 that a supplementary question was asked, do you speak it every day? And of the 1.4 million people who in 2016 identified themselves as able to speak Irish, only 73,000 people speak it every day, use it every day outside of the education system. And only 20,000 of those live in the Gaeltacht, in Irish-speaking communities. And even in the Gaeltacht has a population of 90,000 people. So even in the areas which are identified as Irish-speaking, where it's supposed to be the first language of everyday social interaction, English speakers outnumber Irish speakers by 4 to 1. So it's not sustainable. And the real question now is that you have any number of people like me. The majority of daily speakers of Irish are like me, people for whom it's a private language or a domestic language or a working language, but live in an English-speaking world rather than in communities which sharpen and develop the language. And the question is, can a language survive with those kind of speakers if the well to which we all return to replenish our understanding of the language frequently, if that dries up finally? 20,000 people in those communities is simply not sufficient. You know, like I was 17 or 18 when I started writing, and geez, within a year I was on television because there was an understanding in RT. There was people with an interest in the language, with an interest in poetry, who were suddenly producers, and there was a whole court of people who were radical, political, left-wing, and for whom culture was part of their alternative sense of the world.